History sleeps uneasily in the ancient stones of Prague. This time, my path leads me to a city of spires and shadows, where a legend carved from clay and Kabbalistic magic has awakened. The Golem walks again, a colossal force of destruction. But is it merely a mindless automaton, or is there a consciousness, a soul, trapped within its earthen form? And who, or what, has unleashed its ancient power upon the modern world? The dust from the Philippines had barely settled when a new, altogether different kind of anomaly pinged on my radar. This one didn't come through shadowy encrypted channels or terrified whispers from a remote village. It was a meticulously detailed report, forwarded by an old academic contact I occasionally corresponded with, a historian specializing in obscure European folklore and occult studies. The subject, a series of bizarre and highly destructive incidents in the ancient Jewish quarter of Prague. The reports described significant structural damage to old buildings, heavy market stalls overturned as if by a giant hand, and deep, oversized footprints pressed into cobblestones. Footprints seemingly made of packed earth or clay. Eyewitness accounts, though scarce and often dismissed by local authorities as hysteria or exaggeration, spoke of a colossal, lumbering figure, vaguely humanoid, glimpsed in the dead of night. The conclusion my contact had hesitantly drawn, one that sent a peculiar thrill of anticipation and unease through me, was that the legendary Golem of Prague had somehow awakened. A golem. This was a departure from the flesh and blood horrors or ethereal spirits I usually dealt with. An artificial being, sculpted from clay, brought to life not by biological mutation or supernatural possession, but by ancient Kabbalistic rituals and sacred words. A creature intrinsically linked to history, to a specific culture, to a potent, almost forgotten form of magic. The intellectual curiosity, a part of me that even the agency hadn't managed to fully extinguish, was piqued. My initial skepticism, however, was a hard habit to break. Prague was an old city, full of old grudges and hidden agendas. Could this be sophisticated vandalism, deliberately staged to evoke a famous legend? A way to scare off developers, perhaps, or settle an old score? It was plausible. The world was full of con artists and those who exploited belief for their own ends. Yet, the detailed forensic evidence in the report, the sheer force implied by the destruction, the unique composition of the footprints, gnawed at my cynicism. And there was an undeniable atmosphere surrounding the accounts, a sense of something ancient and immensely powerful stirring from a long slumber. It resonated with a part of me that understood the thin veil between the mundane and the truly monstrous. The decision to go to Prague was made quickly. This wasn't just a hunt. It was an investigation into history, into a legend made manifest. My preparation this time involved less honing of combat skills and more immersion in arcane lore. I delved into the history of the Golem of Prague, the stories of Rabbi Judah Loel ben Bezalel, the 16th century scholar and mystic said to have created it to protect the Jewish community from persecution. I researched the basics of Kabbalah, the mystical Jewish tradition from which the Golem's creation stemmed, learning about the Shem, the sacred name of God, or a specific sequence of Hebrew letters, supposedly inscribed on a parchment and placed in the Golem's mouth or on its forehead to animate it. The word emet, meaning truth in Hebrew, was often associated with its animation, and the removal of the first letter of that word, the letter Aleph, to form met, meaning death, was said to be the way to deactivate it. It was a fascinating, complex web of history, religion, and magic. Whether the Golem was a literal truth or a powerful metaphor, something was happening in Prague that defied easy explanation. As I packed my bag, adding a few more scholarly texts alongside my usual, more practical gear, I felt a different kind of anticipation than usual. This wasn't just about facing a monster, it was about confronting a legend, a piece of living history. And I had a feeling the ancient stones of Prague held secrets far deeper and more dangerous than any simple act of vandalism could explain. Prague greeted me with a labyrinth of cobblestone streets, towering spires that pierced a perpetually overcast sky, and an almost palpable sense of history. The air itself seemed to hum with centuries of secrets, triumphs, and tragedies. I found a modest room in a guest house just outside the old town, a base camp from which to launch my investigation into this city of legends. My first destination was Yosefov, the old Jewish quarter. Even in the daylight, the narrow, winding alleys felt shadowed and mysterious. Ancient synagogues stood like silent sentinels, their weathered stones whispering tales of a resilient people and their mystical traditions. The weight of history here was immense, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking through a place where the veil between worlds was particularly thin. It was easy to imagine a creature like the Golem striding through these very streets centuries ago. The sites of the recent vandalism were cordoned off, but a discreet approach and a few well-placed questions to a nervous-looking beat cop got me close enough. The destruction was significant. Sections of old brick walls had crumbled as if struck by a battering ram. Heavy iron gates were twisted out of shape. In one courtyard, a centuries-old stone fountain lay in pieces, shattered by an incredible force. And then there were the footprints. Massive, vaguely humanoid indentations pressed deep into the earth or dislodged cobblestones, clearly made of packed, dark river clay. No ordinary vandal could have caused this. This was the work of something immensely powerful, something unnatural. My attempts to gather information from official channels were met with a predictable mix of bureaucratic stonewalling and thinly veiled attempts to downplay the incidents. The official line was structural instability in old buildings, or a highly organized gang of vandals using specialized equipment. They were clearly either trying to cover something up to avoid panic, or they were genuinely baffled and out of their depth. Either way, they weren't going to be much help. I knew I needed to find someone with specialized knowledge, someone who understood the Golem not just as a piece of folklore, but as a potential reality. My academic contact had provided a few leads: scholars, historians, and more intriguingly, a name whispered in connection with the modern-day study of Kabbalah in Prague. It was a long shot, but in my line of work, long shots were often the only shots I had. The trail led me to a quiet, unassuming antiquarian bookstore tucked away in a less-traveled corner of Josefov. The air inside was thick with the scent of old paper and binding glue. Behind a towering counter stacked high with ancient-looking tomes sat an elderly man with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than he let on. "I'm looking for someone who might have a deep understanding of local legends," I began, choosing my words carefully. "Specifically, the Golem." The old man looked at me over the rim of his spectacles, a flicker of something. Interest? Caution? In his gaze. He didn't speak for a long moment, then finally said, his voice a dry rustle, "The Golem is a story for tourists, mostly. A protector from a bygone era." "Perhaps," I conceded. "But recent events suggest that some stories have a way of reawakening." I showed him a discreetly taken photo of one of the massive clay footprints. His eyes lingered on the photo, and the carefully constructed facade of disinterest seemed to crack. "Just a little. Such things are best left undisturbed," he said, though his tone now carried less conviction. "The old ways, they have power, and power, misused, can be dangerous." I pressed gently, explaining I wasn't there to sensationalize or exploit, but to understand, and potentially to help prevent further destruction. After a long silence, during which he seemed to be weighing me up, he finally sighed. "There is a woman," he said, his voice dropping lower. "A Lara Vasek. She is a scholar. Her family has old connections to these matters. She is not easy to find, and she does not suffer fools gladly. But if anyone in Prague today truly understands the Golem, it is her." He wrote down an address on a scrap of paper, a street in a quiet residential part of the city. "Tell her Mendel sent you, and be respectful of her knowledge. It is not a game." Mendel, the old bookseller. It was a start. A fragile thread leading into the heart of Prague's ancient mystery. Alara Vasek. I had a feeling my investigation was about to take a significant turn. The address Mendel had given me led to an old, unassuming apartment building in a quieter, more residential part of Prague, away from the main tourist throngs. There was no nameplate for Alara Vasek, just a discreet buzzer next to a heavy wooden door. I pressed it, a sense of cautious anticipation building. The door was opened not by an elderly scholar as I might have half expected, but by a woman who looked to be in her late 30s. She had dark, intense eyes that seemed to assess me in an instant, and a cascade of equally dark hair pulled back loosely from a high forehead. There was an air of quiet intelligence about her, and a certain weariness, as if she carried the weight of generations. This had to be Alara Vasek. "Mendel sent me," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "I'm investigating the recent disturbances in Josefov. He thought you might be able to shed some light on the Golem." Her expression didn't change, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "Mendel is an old friend, but he sometimes speaks too freely of matters best left to those who understand them." She didn't invite me in immediately, her stance clearly indicating a degree of suspicion. As an outsider, particularly one inquiring about such sensitive and esoteric subjects, I expected as much. "I'm not here to exploit your traditions or sensationalize a legend, Ms. Vasek," I said, trying to convey sincerity. "There's something real happening out there, something causing significant damage, and I believe it's connected to the Golem. My only aim is to understand it, and if it's a threat, to stop it before more harm is done." I showed her one of the clearer photos of the clay footprints. She studied the photo for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry more than just immediate frustration, she stepped back, gesturing for me to enter. "Come in, mister. Ryder. Alex Ryder." Her apartment was filled with books, floor-to-ceiling shelves overflowing with ancient-looking leather-bound volumes, scrolls, and manuscripts, their titles in Hebrew, Aramaic, and other languages I didn't recognize. The air smelled of old parchment, incense, and something else, a faint, earthy aroma. It felt less like a home and more like a sanctuary for forgotten knowledge. We sat at a heavy wooden table, and after a period of somewhat tense silence, during which she seemed to be further evaluating my intentions, Alara began to speak. Her voice was low, measured, but carried an undeniable authority. "The Golem of Prague is not a mere fairy tale, Mr. Ryder," she began, her dark eyes fixed on mine. "He was real. Created by the great Rabbi Lo from the clay of the Vltava River, animated by the sacred name the Shem placed within him. A protector, born of desperation, to shield our people from persecution in dark times." She explained the process, the intricate Kabbalistic rituals, the precise sequence of Hebrew letters that formed the Shem, the word emet, truth, inscribed upon its forehead, breathing life into the inert clay. She spoke of its immense strength, its unwavering obedience to its creator. "But such power," she continued, a somber note entering her voice, "is a double-edged sword. The Golem, while a protector, was also a force of nature difficult to control. Its strength, if unchecked, could turn destructive. That is why Rabbi Lo, in his wisdom, eventually removed the animating principle, changing emet to met, death, returning the Golem to lifeless clay, to be hidden away, to rest." "So it shouldn't be active now?" I asked. Alara shook her head, a troubled look crossing her features. "No. He has rested for centuries in the attic of the old new synagogue, or so the legends say. His reawakening now is highly irregular, profoundly disturbing. It suggests that someone or something has interfered. Someone with knowledge they should not possess, or with intentions that are far from pure." Her words confirmed my own suspicions. This wasn't a random occurrence. The Golem's rampage wasn't a natural reanimation. Something, or someone, was pulling the strings. "What could reanimate it?" I pressed. "And why?" "The knowledge to create or reanimate a Golem is deeply esoteric, Mr. Ryder, guarded for centuries," Alara said. It would require not only the correct ritual incantations, but also access to the golem itself and the will or the audacity to tamper with such a powerful, sacred creation. As for why, power, chaos, a misguided attempt to control a force beyond their comprehension, the reasons are as old as human folly itself. Her insight was invaluable. She wasn't just a scholar reciting folklore. She spoke with a deep, almost personal understanding of the golem and the traditions surrounding it. I had found my expert, and it seemed our investigation was just beginning to scratch the surface of a much deeper, more dangerous mystery. With Alara Vasik's knowledge as a guide, our investigation took on a new focus. She knew the old quarter intimately, its hidden passages, its forgotten cellars, the places where a creature like the golem might seek refuge or where ancient energies still resonated. We spent the next few days meticulously examining the sites of destruction, not just for physical clues, but for patterns, for any indication of intent beyond mindless violence. Alara was a revelation. She moved through the ancient streets with a quiet confidence, her understanding of Kabbalistic symbolism and local history shedding new light on details I would have overlooked. While I brought my practical investigative skills, she brought a depth of esoteric knowledge that was both fascinating and at times unsettling. As we pieced together the golem's movements, something began to trouble me. The destruction, while immense, wasn't entirely random. It seemed to follow a path, or perhaps it was reacting to something specific. In one instance, it had smashed through the wall of an old workshop, but had left the ancient tools inside untouched, almost as if it were searching for something else. In another, it had toppled a statue in a small square, but then had stood amidst the rubble for a long time, according to a frightened witness, before lumbering away, leaving an impression of confusion. I started to see, or perhaps project, a rudimentary consciousness onto the golem. It wasn't just a mindless automaton of destruction. There was a crudeness to its actions, yes, but also a strange sort of deliberation. Could a creature of clay, animated by ancient words, possess something akin to thought or even emotion? The idea was both scientifically preposterous and, given what I'd seen in my line of work, disturbingly plausible. The ethical questions began to surface, unbidden. If this golem possessed even a spark of self-awareness, however primitive, did we have the right to simply deactivate it, to essentially end its existence? It was created to be a protector, a servant. If it was now a threat, was that its fault, or the fault of whoever had reawakened it, or perhaps the fault of its very nature? My experiences, particularly with Kawa in Japan, had begun to erode the black and white certainty I once might have had about monsters. Our search eventually led us to the rumored resting place of the original golem, the attic of the old new synagogue. Gaining access was difficult, requiring Alara to use her family's long-standing connections and a great deal of persuasion. The attic was vast, dusty, and filled with centuries of forgotten objects, a mausoleum of history, and in a far, shadowed corner, we found it. Not the golem itself, not yet, but a massive, man-shaped depression in the thick dust, as if something of immense size had recently risen from a long slumber. And nearby, fresh clay, damp and smelling of the Vltava River, clung to the floorboards. It had been here. It was likely using this ancient place as a refuge. We decided to wait, to observe. Hidden in the shadows, armed with Alara's knowledge and my own cautious preparedness, we kept vigil. Hours passed. Then, as the city outside quieted in the deep of night, we heard it, a slow, heavy, dragging sound. The golem emerged from a deeper recess of the attic, a colossal figure of dark, packed clay, easily 9 feet tall. Its movements were ponderous, almost clumsy, yet imbued with an undeniable power. Its featureless face was turned towards a crumbling section of the wall, where a small, faded Star of David was barely visible. And then it did something that stopped my breath. It reached out a massive, clay hand, not to smash, but to gently, almost tenderly, trace the outline of the star. Its movements were awkward, unrefined, but there was an undeniable sense of something. Longing? Memory? It then sat heavily on the dusty floor, its great head bowed, and remained utterly still, a picture of silent, hulking desolation. "The Shem," Alara whispered beside me, her voice barely audible. "It not only animates the clay, Mr. Ryder, it imbues it with a semblance of a soul, a nephesh, a primitive consciousness, capable of basic understanding, and perhaps even emotion. It remembers its purpose, even if that purpose is now distorted or controlled." Her words confirmed the unsettling feeling that had been growing within me. This golem wasn't just a weapon. It was, in some strange, profound way, alive. And if it was alive, then destroying it wasn't a simple matter of deactivation. It was something far more complex, far more morally fraught. The silent, suffering giant before us was a testament to that. And I had a growing suspicion that its current rampage was not of its own volition. The sight of the golem in the synagogue attic, its silent, almost mournful contemplation of the faded Star of David, had a profound impact on both me and Alara. It was no longer just an abstract legend or a destructive force. It was a being with a perceptible, albeit primitive, inner life. We retreated from the attic that night with more questions than answers. The image of the hulking clay figure etched in our minds. Back in Alara's apartment, surrounded by her ancient texts, we began to analyze everything we knew. The golem's reawakening was unnatural. Alara was certain of that. The rituals to animate or reanimate such a being were complex and required specific knowledge that few possessed. For it to simply rise on its own after centuries of dormancy felt improbable. "He wouldn't just wake up, Alex," Alara insisted, her brow furrowed in concentration as she consulted a brittle, leather-bound manuscript. "The Shem provides the spark of life, yes, but it is typically bound by the will of the Creator, or by specific commands given during its animation. For him to be acting with such unfocused, destructive force, yet also showing these signs of confusion, even sorrow, it suggests an external influence, a perversion of his original purpose. My own instincts, honed by years of dealing with unseen enemies and shadowy organizations, agreed with her. This felt orchestrated. The golem's rampage, while appearing chaotic, had a certain underlying direction, as if it were being guided, however crudely. My thoughts, as they often did when confronted with inexplicable power and manipulation, drifted towards the agency. Did they possess the esoteric knowledge, or perhaps a technological equivalent, to reanimate or control such an entity? The idea of them meddling with Kabbalistic magic was a stretch, yet their reach and their willingness to exploit any potential asset knew few bounds. If there was power to be harnessed, they would find a way. If he is being controlled, I mused, there must be a mechanism, a signal, a command, something that's overriding his original programming, or whatever remains of it. We revisited the sites of destruction, this time looking not just at what was broken, but how it was broken, and if there were any commonalities. Alara, with her knowledge of Kabbalistic symbols and protective wards, examined the scenes for any traces of arcane interference. I focused on more conventional clues, unusual energy signatures, remnants of technology, anything out of place. It was Alara who found the first concrete clue. At one of the more recent sites of vandalism, a partially collapsed wall of an old alchemist's shop, she discovered a faint, almost invisible symbol etched into one of the dislodged stones. A symbol that was not part of the original structure, nor was it a recognized Kabbalistic sigil. It was something else, something angular and modern-looking, yet with an unsettling, almost alien geometry. "I don't recognize this," she said, her voice tight with concern as she carefully sketched it. "It feels wrong, like a corruption of sacred patterns." Later, while reviewing some grainy security footage from a camera overlooking a street where the golem had passed, I noticed something else. Just before the golem appeared, there was a brief, almost subliminal flicker of static, an electronic interference. And the golem itself, in its lumbering passage, seemed to momentarily hesitate, its great head tilting as if listening to something I couldn't hear, before continuing its destructive path. "A signal," I said, showing Alara the footage. "It could be reacting to a specific frequency, an ultrasonic command, something that's directing its actions." The pieces were starting to fall into place. The golem wasn't just a reawakened legend, it was a weapon, a tool being wielded by an unseen hand. Our suspicions now fell on a wider range of possibilities. A rogue Kabbalist with a dark agenda, a clandestine organization seeking to weaponize ancient magic, or even, as the faint electronic interference suggested, someone blending arcane knowledge with modern technology. "We can't just deactivate him," Alara stated, her conviction firm. "If he is being controlled, and we simply remove the Shem, his master could potentially find a way to reanimate him again, or create another. We need to find the puppeteer, Alex. We need to cut the strings before we can truly lay the golem to rest." I agreed. Neutralizing the golem was only part of the solution. The true threat lay with whoever had disturbed its ancient slumber and turned a legendary protector into an instrument of chaos. Our hunt had just acquired a new, far more dangerous target. The strange, angular symbol Alara had found, coupled with the electronic interference I'd detected, became the twin focal points of our new investigation. It was a curious blend of ancient mysticism and modern technology, suggesting a sophisticated and unusual adversary. Alara delved into her vast library, cross-referencing the symbol against countless arcane texts and obscure historical records, searching for any group or individual who might employ such a mark. I, meanwhile, used my more contemporary skills, attempting to trace the source of the electronic signals, looking for patterns or unusual transmissions that coincided with the golem's appearances. It was a fascinating, if sometimes frustrating, partnership. Alara's world was one of sacred texts, numerology, and the subtle energies of the spiritual realm. Mine was one of hard evidence, surveillance, and tactical analysis. Yet our disparate approaches began to complement each other. Her interpretations of ancient prophecies or symbolic meanings would sometimes provide context for a piece of data I'd uncovered, and my technical findings would occasionally point her research in a new direction. The sense of urgency was a constant pressure. Every night the golem remained active. The risk of further destruction, or worse, accidental casualties, increased. The city of Prague, with its labyrinthine streets and ancient secrets, felt like a ticking clock. Alara's research into the symbol eventually yielded a tentative connection. It wasn't a traditional Kabbalistic sign, but it bore a faint resemblance to markings used by certain fringe esoteric orders from the early 20th century, groups that had attempted to meld ancient mysticism with emerging scientific theories, often with disastrous or unethical results. Some of these groups had rumored ties to shadowy political or corporate entities. Even back then, my own attempts to pinpoint the electronic signal were more difficult. It was sporadic, heavily encrypted, and seemed to be broadcast from multiple, shifting locations, suggesting a mobile operator or a network of hidden transmitters. However, I did manage to isolate a specific, recurring frequency band that spiked just before each major golem incident. It was a sophisticated signal, clearly designed to be difficult to trace. The breakthrough came when Alara, while examining old city maps and historical accounts of ley lines, supposed channels of natural telluric energy, noticed that the golem's path of destruction, while seemingly random, often intersected with these theorized energy nexuses. And several of these nexuses were located near old, disused industrial sites on the outskirts of Prague, or beneath forgotten sections of the city's vast network of underground tunnels. If someone were trying to amplify a signal to control something as powerful as the golem, Alara hypothesized, they might use these natural energy conduits. And the symbol, it could be a modern perversion, a techno-sigil, designed to interface with both arcane energies and a technological device. Her theory lined up with what I was finding. One of the disused factory complexes she'd identified showed faint but persistent traces of the encrypted signal I was tracking. It was a long shot, but it was the best lead we had. One of Finey, We decided to investigate the factory that night. It was a decaying relic of the industrial era, a vast, shadowy complex of brick and rusted metal. Getting in required bypassing old security systems and navigating crumbling structures, a task more suited to my particular skill set. Ilara, while not a field operative, possessed a quiet courage and a sharp mind that proved invaluable. Inside, amidst the dust and debris, we found it, a hidden, makeshift laboratory. It was a bizarre fusion of old and new, arcane circles chalked on the floor alongside sophisticated electronic consoles, ancient-looking artifacts wired to humming machinery. And in the center of the room, on a large monitor, was a complex schematic of the Golem, with points of light corresponding to the strange symbol we'd found, apparently indicating control nodes. Before we could process it all, we were interrupted. Not by the Golem, but by two men in dark, unmarked tactical gear. They were armed, professional, and clearly not pleased to see us. A brief, brutal confrontation ensued. They were skilled, but I'd faced worse. Ilara, surprisingly, held her own, using her knowledge of the lab's layout to create diversions. After subduing them, we found what we were looking for: a data drive and a series of encrypted communications. The men were clearly hired muscle, not the masterminds. But the information we recovered began to paint a clearer picture. The puppeteer wasn't a rogue Kabbalist or a simple occultist. The level of technological integration, the encrypted signals, the professional security, it all pointed to a well-funded, highly organized group. The communications mentioned Project Claiborne, stabilization of animation matrix, and field testing. And then, a name that made my blood run cold, a name I hadn't seen in any official capacity for years, but one that was seared into the fragments of my memory. Marcus Thorne, my former commander at the agency. The agency, or at least a splinter faction, or Thorne operating on his own with their resources. They weren't just studying the Golem, they were trying to control it, to weaponize it. The destruction in Prague wasn't random. It was a stress test, a field trial. The Golem wasn't just a reawakened legend. It was their newest, most terrifying experiment. And I had walked right into the middle of it. The purpose was clear: chaos for cover, data collection, and perhaps the retrieval or destruction of something specific within the old Jewish quarter that the Golem was being directed towards. The truth was far more sinister than a simple legend come to life. The revelation that Marcus Thorne and, by extension, elements of the agency were behind the Golem's rampage hit me hard. It wasn't just a monster hunt anymore, it was personal. It was a confrontation with the very shadows of my forgotten past. The data drive we'd recovered indicated Thorne's next target, a hidden vault beneath one of Prague's oldest synagogues, rumored to contain ancient Kabbalistic artifacts. Artifacts Thorne likely believed could further enhance his control over the Golem or unlock other forbidden powers. There was no time to waste. We had to intercept him, stop the Golem, and prevent whatever catastrophe Thorne was planning. The chosen synagogue was a place of immense historical and spiritual significance, a fitting, if horrifying, stage for the final act. As Ilara and I approached, under the cover of a moonless, oppressive night, the scene was already one of controlled chaos. Thorne was there, a cold, imposing figure I remembered all too well, flanked by a handful of heavily armed operatives, more professional and dangerous than the two we'd encountered at the lab. And then there was the Golem. It stood like a monstrous sentinel before the synagogue's ancient doors, its clay form pulsing with an unnatural energy, clearly under Thorne's direct command via a device he held. My mind raced. We were outgunned, outmanned. Thorne's objective was the vault. The Golem was his battering ram and his shield. My objective was twofold: stop Thorne and neutralize the Golem, preferably without completely destroying a being that Ilara still believed possessed a spark of something sacred. It was an almost impossible balancing act. "Thorne will use the Golem to breach the vault," Ilara whispered. her face pale but resolute. "While you deal with him and his men, I will attempt the unbinding ritual. I need to get close to the golem, to its forehead, to alter the Shem. It's the only way to truly sever Thorn's control and return it to its rest." It was a dangerous plan, bordering on suicidal for her, but it was our only chance. "Rakah. I'll create a diversion, draw their fire," I said, my voice grim. "Get to the golem when you see an opening. But be careful, Alara. Thorn is ruthless." The fight erupted with brutal efficiency. I opened fire, not on the golem, but on Thorn's operatives, using the ancient architecture of the square for cover. They were well trained, their movements coordinated, but they hadn't factored in someone like me, someone who knew agency tactics, someone fighting with a desperate personal fury. While I engaged Thorn's men, forcing them to focus on me, Ilara, clutching a small, ancient-looking scroll and a stylus, began to move stealthily towards the golem. Thorn, seeing his plan disrupted, barked orders into his comm, his face a mask of cold fury. He directed the golem towards me. "Ryder! Always an interfering pest!" Thorn's voice, amplified by a speaker, boomed across the square. "You should have stayed forgotten!" The golem lumbered towards me, its immense fists raised. I dodged its clumsy but powerful blows, the ground trembling with each impact. This was different from fighting a creature of instinct. This was like fighting a living siege engine, directed by a cold, calculating intelligence. As I battled both the golem and Thorn's remaining operatives, I saw Ilara reach the massive clay figure. Thorn, distracted by my assault, hadn't noticed her approach. She began to chant in low, rapid Hebrew, her hand reaching towards the golem's towering head. Suddenly, the golem paused in its attack on me. Its great head twitched. It let out a low, rumbling groan, a sound that seemed to vibrate with confusion and pain. It looked from me to Thorn, then to Ilara, who was now precariously close, tracing something on its forehead. Thorn, realizing what was happening, roared in anger. "Stop her! Kill the woman!" One of his operatives turned his weapon on Ilara. But before he could fire, the golem did something extraordinary. With a speed that belied its bulk, it swung a massive clay arm. Not at me, not at Ilara, but at the operative, sending him flying across the square. It was a moment of pure, chaotic anime. The golem, its control momentarily fractured, seemed to be lashing out at its tormentors. It then turned its attention towards Thorn, a deep, guttural sound emanating from its clay chest. This was the opening. While Thorn and his last man were reeling from the golem's unexpected rebellion, I pressed my attack, disabling the final operative. Thorn, now alone and facing both me and a seemingly rogue golem, tried to reassert control with his device, but it was too late. Ilara, with a final, desperate cry, completed her ritual. She pressed the stylus hard against the golem's forehead. There was a flash of faint, ethereal light, and the word Emet, that had glowed there with an inner luminescence, changed. The first letter, the Aleph, faded, leaving only MET, death. The golem shuddered violently. The unnatural energy pulsing within it seemed to drain away. Its movements became slower, heavier. It looked down at its own clay hands, then up at the ancient synagogue. A final, almost mournful sound escaping it before it began to crumble, not in an explosion, but slowly, like dry earth returning to dust. Thorn, seeing his prized weapon disintegrate, let out a yell of pure, unadulterated rage. He lunged for his sidearm, but I was faster. A single, well-placed shot disarmed him. The fight was over. As the dust settled, Ilara, pale and trembling but unharmed, looked at the pile of inert clay that had once been the golem. Thorn was secured, his plans in ruins. The ancient protector of Prague was finally, truly at rest. The square before the ancient synagogue was unnervingly quiet in the pre-dawn light. The only sounds were the distant city beginning to stir, and the ragged breathing of Marcus Thorn, who was now securely bound and awaiting the arrival of local authorities. Authorities I'd anonymously tipped off, though I doubted they'd ever understand the full scope of what had transpired here. Ilara Vasic stood beside me, gazing at the large mound of dark, inert clay that had, only moments ago, been the formidable Golem of Prague. A sense of profound relief washed over me, yet it was tinged with an unexpected melancholy. The Golem, a creature of immense power and ancient legend, was finally at peace, its centuries of slumber no longer disturbed by the machinations of men like Thorn. But in its brief, chaotic reawakening, I had glimpsed something more than just a mindless automaton. I'd seen confusion, perhaps even a flicker of its original protective instinct when it struck out at Thorn's operative. It had been a tool, a weapon, but it had also, in its own way, been a victim. Ilara seemed to share my somber mood. "He served his purpose long ago," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet reverence. "He was a guardian, born of need. It was never intended for him to be a pawn in such profane games." Her words resonated. This whole affair had forced me to confront unsettling questions about the nature of creation, of artificial life, and the blurry line between an animated object and a conscious being. The Golem, brought to life by sacred words and human will, had possessed a nephesh, a primitive soul. Where did that place it on the spectrum of existence? And what right did anyone, Rabbi Lowe, Thorn, or even myself, have to dictate its fate? And then there was the agency. Thorn's involvement was a chilling confirmation of my deepest fears. They weren't just reacting to supernatural phenomena, they were actively seeking to understand, control, and weaponize it. The Golem was Project Claiborne. What other projects did they have? What other ancient powers or forgotten sciences were they meddling with? The thought that my own lost past might be entangled with such morally bankrupt endeavors was a constant, gnawing dread. With the authorities on their way to deal with Thorn and his men, who would likely spin a tale of corporate espionage or terrorism, anything but the truth, Ilara and I turned our attention to the Golem's remains. "He should be returned to his resting place," Ilara stated, "the attic of the old new synagogue. It is where he belongs." It was a difficult, somber task. Even as inert clay, the Golem's form was immense. With the help of a few trusted members of Ilara's community, sworn to secrecy, we carefully transported the clay, piece by piece, back to the dusty, forgotten attic. There, under Ilara's guidance, the clay was respectfully arranged, covered once more, to await what? Another awakening centuries hence? Or an eternal, undisturbed slumber? I didn't know. Petu Kadib. As the first true light of dawn broke over Prague, I prepared to leave. Ilara met me near the Charles Bridge. The city's ancient stones bathed in a soft, golden glow. "You have done a great service to this city, Alex Ryder," she said, her dark eyes holding a newfound respect. "You walk a difficult path, caught between worlds. It seems to be my lot in life," I replied, a wry, tired smile touching my lips. "Be wary," she cautioned, her voice low. "Those who seek to control such powers, like Thorn, they are not easily deterred. The agency, as you call it, they will have other projects, other agents, and they will remember you." It was a sobering thought, but not an unexpected one. My past was a relentless hunter, and it seemed the agency was its most persistent hound. Ilara handed me a small, intricately carved wooden box, a token, for a traveler who understands more than he lets on. It may offer some clarity, or perhaps just a reminder that not all ancient knowledge is bent to ill purpose. I accepted it, a sense of gratitude for this unlikely alliance. We had faced a legend, an agency operative, and profound ethical questions, and somehow we had prevailed. As I walked away from Prague, leaving its spires and shadows behind, I carried with me more than just a strange wooden box. I carried the weight of new knowledge, the memory of a silent clay guardian, and a deeper understanding of the complex tapestry of good, evil, and the myriad shades in between that defined the world I was forced to navigate. The hunt continued, as it always would, but perhaps, just perhaps, the hunter himself was slowly, painfully, beginning to change.